I'm going to just say that this evening's talk is by Keith Barnes, one of the founders of Tropical Birding, and he's going to be talking about birds of Greater Southern Africa, the book and beyond. And Keith, I'm going to hand over to you, and you are going to do such a better job of introducing yourself than I could ever do. So over to you.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks, guys. We really appreciate you tuning in for this webinar. Yeah, it's exciting to be giving it. So Birds of Greater Southern Africa is the latest of the Helm series of guides. And in terms of an introduction, by the way, I'm sort of going straight into the talk. What I'll do is you'll actually learn who I am during the talk. So I'm not going to give you much of an introduction other to say briefly that I started off as a young ornithologist at the University of Cape Town, ended up working as a scientist initially, then became a business person in the tourism side of things. And now, I guess, sort of dabbling in publishing again, but more in the role of kind of tools for layman users and, popularized stuff. So the talk is really about the book, the journey to make it, the people who came along and were key and pivotal in helping us get it made. Then what kind of makes a book different? Like how does it differ from anything else that's out there on the market? And then a little bit more about the future, what can we expect beyond it? Because like many of these things, the publication of a book isn't really the end of a process, it's the beginning of a process. And I certainly hope that'll be the case for this book. And so I'm going to take you there and try and see where we go from here. So I will say that no major book like this is an undertaking by a single individual. I would say I had the dream team with me. It was certainly a case of me picking the people I worked with very carefully. Obviously, there was myself, and you always need somebody who's the driver of things and who's kind of in charge. The two books, there I am, the two books to the right of me were The Important Bird Areas of Southern Africa and Eskom Red Data Book of South Africa, Lesotho, and Swaziland. And those were published in 98 and 2000 respectively. And what was interesting about those projects is that I had to collaborate and coordinate with a lot of other people. So I think the IBA's book, there was 20, 25 different authors involved. The Eskom Red Data Book, something similar. And I was quite young at that stage, but it was a very good process in terms of learning how to get everybody on the same page regarding a project and making sure they fit the text into the same kind of stylistic stuff and things like that. And then the bottom three publications were the first ones I did with Princeton University Press, and those are more popularizing the science. So it's, I've had the background of coming from a much more scientific conservation background, and then also the popular science stuff. So it wasn't my first rodeo. I probably would have not survived if it was. But of course, I was surrounded by some really, really great people. The guy on the top is Terry Stevenson, and the one below is John Fanshawe. Terry works for Field Guides, another bird tour company. John is a BirdLife International conservationist. Both of these guys spent a heck of a lot of time in Kenya and elsewhere in Africa. And they were the originators of the Birds of East Africa and were key collaborators in Birds of Horn of Africa. So they'd kind of been around the block. They'd done this before. They understood Helm and the way Helm works. And they were just wonderful people to work with, super knowledgeable, super great field people, but also, there was a history there where they were able to help guide me in a way that was really, really handy that, I might have kind of taken a different direction if it hadn't been for a lot of their key input as to what makes these things work and what doesn't. And then without a doubt, the absolute keystone people in any field guide project are going to be your artists. This is John Gale. John is just a incredibly humble but gifted artist who is willing to do almost anything to make his art as perfect as it can be in terms of having something that's technical. And what I loved about working with both John and that is Brian Small is not only were these paintings beautiful, but they were absolutely 100% spot on accurate, well, you'll see how we work to make them 100% spot on accurate. But not only is it a thing of beauty to look at, but it is technically close to perfect. But even those are the five people that really were the key core contributors. We also had a guest illustrator who I'm sure is well known to Southern African audience. One and only Fancy Peacock. He helped us with the larks, which is just something that we know he knows better than anybody else. And that was really, really fun to work with Fancy in that regard. But it's not just the authors and the artists who put in the heavy work. We had a very, very good editorial team in Guy Kerwin, who has probably edited 60 or 70 bird books, field guides, and Nigel Redman at the center there. And then I got this nudibranch slide because I'm afraid she's very cryptic on the internet and it's hard to get a picture of. But our designer, Julie Dando, is just an incredible person that's been able to manipulate digital images and design, put paintings together and text together in a way that makes a beautiful publication. So just quickly going back to where I started, just run through a personal history. Of course, our parents are pivotal in our lives a lot of the time. Here's my dad teaching me how to make Harvey Wallbangers and medium cream sherries for Christmas Day when I was 10 years old. Probably would be locked up in jail for stuff like that these days, but those were the street skills I learned. But he was a birder, and so was my mom. And we would go out into the field and I would be exposed to this stuff, but the penny didn't really drop that this is what I wanted to do until we were on a vacation in the Drakensberg one year. And he told me he was looking for this bird, I'm sure familiar to a bunch of you, the bearded vulture lammergeier. And being a know-all 13-year-old, I delved through his books and was quick to tell him that he didn't stand a chance at seeing this mystical bird because it was rare and we were common people. But being a bird that is so magically distinctive, when one came soaring just a few yards over my head, not only was it someone telling me I was seeing something special, but I knew it. And that was it. That was hook, line, and sinker. That's OCD for you, I guess. A few years later, down at the bottom there, excuse me, got a bit of a croak in my throat. Went off to the University of Cape Town and the Fitzpatrick Institute, where I studied ornithology and ended up doing both master's degrees in conservation biology and a PhD in phylogenetic studies, larks. The picture at the bottom left, I don't know if you recognize the other characters there, but it's Callan Cohen and Jonathan Rousseau. That was my truck, and we drove off to Kenya from Santon. And I spent far too long studying larks and their relationships. Excuse me. Now, the one thing about that period of life, was that I also was able to travel and explore the world and go birding. A lot of my academic pursuits were really driven by my wanderlust. So I worked out how my dad was a Brit, so I had this British passport, and although South Africans shortly after the end of apartheid were not always welcome in other parts of Africa, that British passport was very handy for me. And so I'd go up to Malawi in particular. And there, unfortunately, there were no field guides available at all. And so I ended up having to come back to the Fitz and look through books like this, McWhirth, Praed and Grant. And here you can see a ridiculous key to the larks to try and identify stuff. It was clunky. It was messy. There is, excuse me. There is the McWhirth, Praed and Grant book. I think there were multiple volumes, at least 2 or 3 volumes. And there were all these text-heavy things with no illustrations. And there's my Birds of Greater Southern Africa to just show people how far we've come in terms of creating content that's easy to use and access and fun to work with. The one key story that was fascinating was on my first trip up to Malawi. I went to a place called the Zomba Plateau, and I ended up seeing an apalus there. Looked a little bit like a bar-throated apalus, but it definitely looked radically different. So it was actually, if we look at that picture over there, which is from the book, it's the bird under the obvious bar-throated apalus is there at the top that most South Africans are familiar with. Very yellow belly and yellow throat and little black mask and olive green back. And, I knew I'd seen something exciting and this was a lifer, and I was really excited about it. Of course, it took nearly 6 weeks before I could come back and actually go through these horrendous type of keys to key this animal out. It turns out that at the time, the taxonomy said it was just another bath-roaded apaler. So I was absolutely gutted initially that I'd gone all this way, and typical birder reaction to things. Upset when you see something and then it turns out it's not a lifer. But I guess the stories come full circle. About in 2010, more taxonomic work was done in the group, and it turns out that it's currently split. And so I guess the lesson to be learned is if you finally want a new bird, you just write your own book and decide what it is. So there it is. It's in the Birds of Greater Southern Africa. It's called yellow-throated apalis. It's one of Malawi's only endemic birds. It's quite rare, and it certainly is a looker. So it's well worth finding and having a look at one day. Also, I mean, this is kind of a fun one. There were no commercial pelagic trips in those days. There were no flocks at sea. So the only way to really get out and get field experience with a lot of these seabirds was to work on them. So I was one of the first people working on the long line fisheries boats, assessing bycatch of seabirds. And it was wonderful because, I got weeks and weeks and months of field experience out there on the oceans that I couldn't buy any other way. But eventually my life took a bit of a twist away from the more academic line of work, and we started a company called Tropical Birding Tours. Probably subsisted on gruel and lentils for the first 5 years, like most people who start a company like this. But fortunately, we're up and running now, running hundreds of tours a year. So it has been a very successful venture in my life, and one I'm grateful for. But one of the fun things as it relates to the book about the travel was that I got to travel around the world and see birds that in Southern Africa would be sort of things that are vagrants that you'd maybe only encounter once or twice in your life. So that's Papua New Guinea, me at the top. And, that's where I got to cut my teeth and basically spend time learning birds like lesser frigate bird or black-naped tern, things like that. Became familiar with them. When I was on the Tibetan Plateau, we were able to look at things like wheatears and understand the differences between northern wheatear and Isabelline wheatear. So this travel not just was a fun opportunity to get around the world, but it also gave me a real insight into some of the real tricky ID issues and the tricky birds we end up seeing in the region. And then, of course, given that I was traveling to a bunch of different countries, I got to use a bunch of different field guides. And so by doing that, you end up learning, well, gee, this is something I really don't like about this field guide. This is something I really like about this field guide. So basically by getting exposure to so many different field guides and different authors in the way they do things, I think I really became quite honed at working out, at least for me, what I love about certain elements of these books and what I don't love about them and what I didn't want to do. So in the interim, I'd assumed that, apartheid had ended and we'd get these bird books for places like Malawi and Zambia, and we did to a certain extent. But I think the Malawi one was published in the early 90s and the Zambia book was in the mid 90s. And to be honest, that was it. So these were supplemental books, so you'd have your Roberts or your Newmans, and then you would take these things, and this would just be the extra birds in the region. So no text discussing the subspecies up there, no real maps for the things that weren't occurring or were occurring in the Southern Africa region. And I had just assumed that somebody would come along and actually do these regions justice, and they never did. And so when the seed was eventually in my head, it was like an area I'd spent time as a kid birding and loving and enjoying. And so I did tug on my heartstrings, and it was like, we really, really need to do these parts of the world some justice, because they had kind of been forgotten between what is typically considered Southern Africa up to the Kunene and the Zambezi rivers, and then the classical East Africa, which goes as far south as Tanzania. And this is a plate from the very, very first Birds of East Africa. And this is when I think I really saw a field guide for the first time that ticked all the boxes in terms of what I want to know. This book, again, is 20, But at least this plate is 26 years old. So this is not a very modern plate, but and not very modern maps or anything, but it's from a long time ago, you know. And those illustrations are still absolutely gorgeous. Once you get close to perfection, those are I think, yeah, John Gale's illustrations of the wood doves and the macro dove. You don't really need anything much better than that. So I think when it came full circle, I loved the idea of these illustrations and these artists, and I wanted to work with them. And so I wanted to set up a project where I could work with these great guys, include these regions that I kind of thought were reasonably forgotten about, uh, and do something different and unusual rather than just. I didn't want to do just another bird book for Southern Africa. That would have been boring. So sorry for the ladies out there. I know this is a little bit rude to suggest that this is as painful as pregnancy or labor, but this is as close as maybe I'll ever come to actually having something that approaches the anxiety and the effort that one takes to have a child. So I mean, I have a child myself, but you know what I mean, to actually give birth. So we signed a contract for the book in about 2017, but I was very, very busy running around the world, running tours and what have you. And it really was COVID. When COVID came along, that just really that shut down our business, but it also meant that I had time and space to pursue this project effectively. And I think I was quite, I mean, you look at this in retrospect, but it was quite lucky in a way that I was able to have all the time to sit down and really do it. And so for a couple of years, I just really dedicated myself to focusing on making this book as good as I could. Here are a couple of the spreadsheets that are the planning spreadsheets. So when you think about writing these books, you don't just sit down and start typing. You know, it took us 4 or 5 months of work. The big one down the bottom is really just a taxonomic spreadsheet where we have 4 global taxonomies that we needed to consider. We then had regional taxonomies like Roberts, and you know what the different subspecies were that were described by each of these things, and then mapping them up and aligning, you know, which agreed and which disagreed. So yeah, a lot of background work. The one at the top right, that's just the plate design. And so you've got to really think carefully about the layout of these books. You know, they all look kind of neat and all the words fit on the page and what have you. But you have to really consider, well, how many species am I going to put on each plate? How many words am I going to be able to dedicate to each of the species on that plate? How are they going to line up? Are these going to be good birds to put together on a plate in terms of their comparison, in terms of the imagery and stuff like that? So yeah, not a minor undertaking, even just to plan the book. And then of course the plate design. So the sketch there, that's you know, work that the artists do beforehand where you decide. So I would submit to them and I would say, you know, I want under wing and an upper wing. I would like a head illustration. I need a juvenile, I need adult and a molting plumage of X, Y, or Z. So we go through this process of laying out the plates as we'd want or expect them to appear. And then sometimes you even have to go right back to the museums to look at the skins because you have this disagreement in the literature in terms of what a bird actually looks like. So yeah, it's a pretty convoluted process to do your damnedest to get it right. Then of course the artist would submit the illustrations to you and you would go through them very, very carefully. And sometimes they'd need to be tweaked. So, you know, the eyebrows are a little bit too broad, or maybe we need to change that base of the bill from slightly yellow pink to a little bit more pink and stuff like that. So it's pretty meticulous work to get to the stage where you're happy. And then, of course, and I thought it was fun to give you, you know, the raw materials as how they were done in the book. So that's, you know, my hand drawn maps. I mean, I could have done those things digitally, but I'm not smart enough to do it. And I really liked the idea of the hand drawn stuff because I could tinker with it a bit easier. But yeah, so that's how you go about doing the maps, and then all this stuff goes off to the designers. And then eventually, after hundreds of proofs, and of course, you always send this stuff out to a variety of people to comment on it to make sure that mistakes haven't, well, that there's few mistakes as possible creep through. Oh yes, and then sorry, this last one with the sooty tern up there, the young sooty tern. There's a number of digital manipulations we needed to make to the illustration. So sometimes there were errors in the previous books that I picked up on, and then I preferred to change things. A good example was you see that white belly patch just wasn't extensive enough on the original illustration for the Birds of East Africa book. And then there are things like the subspecies that occur in Southern Africa. So, maybe something like a somber greenball, which is pretty widespread African bird, but they've illustrated races that are in East Africa, and then you need to digitally manipulate them. So Julie was just an absolute magician with that sort of stuff at changing iris color, changing bare part coloration, like base of the beak or feet or something like that. And yeah, and then after a few years, you wind up with a book in your hands. So that's in brief, kind of how it came about to be. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes this book different. I mean, why is it special? Why is it different to anything else in the region? So obviously we're talking about a geographic region that is not the same as every other field guide that's been done for Southern Africa before. Hence, it's Greater Southern Africa. We've included Zambia, Malawi, and northern Mozambique for the first time in the region. And we've also included the Oceanic Islands, which I think are 9 or 10 groups of islands that stretch from Bouvet in the south to the Tristan group, all the way across to the French, Crozets, and Kerguelen groups on the far side. And a lot of people say to me, well, why don't you just do a book on Zambia and Malawi? And, I'll save that for the future thing, but we will be divvying this book up into slightly more bite-sized chunks at some stage. But a lot of my emphasis was on trying to make Southern Africans realize that I mean, obviously obviously people know this, but when you actually see it in a book, you can feel it a whole lot more that these countries are connected to us, their birds are connected to us, they're not that far away. And, even if you told me that you had no interest in never visiting Zambia, having a book with a bunch of Zambia's birds in is handy because those things might pitch south of the border at some stage and be vagrants. So obviously the region's different, and there it is. So yeah, we thought we'd expand it a little bit so that folks got a different take on what Southern Africa is all about. And then, yeah, the other fun thing is that South Africans just generally never really travel north of the Kunene and the Zambezi rivers, even after apartheid, and that was somewhat surprising. And I wanted to tie Southern Africa into that region so that people were tempted further north. And what could tempt you any more than two cool birds like bar-tailed trogon and white-winged Apalis? I mean, there's some truly incredibly sexy birds. And if you're sitting at Vic Falls or somewhere like that, it's really not that far to get through to those birds and animals and go and see them. So, and then in terms of its philosophy, I try to make it slightly different too. A lot of people think about getting to a species ID as fast as possible. There's almost like this race to get to what species level is so I can tick it and move on. Now, obviously, you need that information. It's key. It's important. But I wanted to sort of take a little bit of a step back and help people understand variability in birds. Because like most people know, some of the times when you're trying to identify a bird, you'll get to you won't be able to identify it because you don't really understand the variation that's out there in these things. So these birds vary in a variety of different ways. They vary in terms of their size. Males and females are often quite different. They vary in terms of the way the sexes look different to each other sometimes. They vary from season to season because of plumage differences. They vary in age sometimes. There's also racial variation, and that was kind of key. So this is from my PhD. I did a phylogenetic study on spike-keeled larks in South Africa, and those are the sample sites in orange there on the left. And the numbers that you see on that left-hand illustration are the traditional races that we find described for the region. And then on the right was how the genetic groupings ended up grouping out. And as you can see there's a complete disconnect, right? So it's not like there was a bunch of races that were traditionally described based on plumage and morphometrics that fitted well with the genetic races that we see on the right. But for our intents and purposes, it doesn't really matter what's happening genetically. What happens is what you see in the field. So we wanted to make sure that we described every one of the traditional races, so long as they were different enough to be diagnosable. What I mean by that is if you have two taxa, and taxa are things like subspecies, that are essentially indistinguishable, then it really doesn't matter. But if you can tell them apart, it's really cool to know. And now we kind of already know that, and I know this because when we aligned all the taxonomies together, you would see that some of these descriptions would directly contradict each other. We'd try and go and do a little bit of homework on that, but it wasn't always easy. But I'm pretty sure that if we can actually get Southern Africans to start going out and really investigating what's in this book in terms of the subspecific designations, we'll find out new information. There's already some stuff that I'm sure is wrong in here. So it's a bit of a challenge, you know. Go out and I'd love to find out that whatever the race of spike-heeled lark in Kalahari doesn't look like what I said it looked like in the book, because that's new information that's kind of using birders and citizen science to help us advance our cause. So a lot of fun in museums looking at races and making sure that they were as accurate as possible. But also what was really fun about this book is here we have a page where we have as few as 2 species. I really, really didn't want to have to be prescribed that, you know, this book has to put 5 species on a plate or 6 species on a plate. I think what you want is you want the information that's going to get you down to the most diagnostic level on that bird that you want. So Western yellow wagtail is a bird that has an incredible number of interesting different races. And I wanted to make sure that all of them were described and that they were done in a way that you could identify both males and females in these different plumages. So sometimes I do 6 species on a plate, especially when they're pretty straightforward. Things like bee-eaters are generally not that difficult to identify most of the time. And, you know, the pretty pictures tell the story. So I don't really need to have a whole lot of text there about how to tell a European bee-eater from a carmine bee-eater. What I do need the text for is when things get tricky in subspecies and when things get tricky in terms of birds that are hard to tell apart. So the illustration is really designed for everybody, but are really useful for beginners because I think they go to the illustrations and, like I said before, they're beautiful and they're accurate. Text is more designed for people who want to delve into understanding as much as they possibly can about the racial variation and variation in these birds, given the limitations of the space that we have for any book. It still has to be a field guide. So here's some good examples. It's one of Fancy's great lark plates. And you can see there we've got 3 races of the fawn-colored lark, including a red variant, a pale sort of central desert variant, and a slightly darker variant. The different races of Barlow's lark and Karoo larks. So we've got streaky variants, we've got red variants, we've got brown variants. So that I think is fairly unique in a field guide in the region in terms of the extent to which we've done it. Obviously, other field guides have done this kind of thing, but I don't think it's quite to the same extent. And then again, so here's another good example of a tricky group of birds to identify. The Baltic gull, steppe gull plate. These are all lesser blackback gulls, okay? So I gave them those names. That's not because I'm designating them as species. It's because I'm designating them as subtypes. But I think we ended up with 880 words of text and 22 illustrations for the lesser blackback gull complex. And so I do that because, so whether it's Baltic, Hughlins types, or steppe types, I do that because I really think it's required, it's needed to be able to identify down to that level. So yeah, so that's what I think makes the book a little bit different. The other thing that's been really neat is that we're dealing with essentially 2 world-class artists. So there's a level of uniformity in the book that's absent in other books. As soon as you got more than 4 artists, I think books inevitably tend to have less uniformity and a little bit more hodgepodge sort of styles when it comes to the illustrations, whereas we're really, really lucky to have these 2 excellent artists illustrating most of the book. And then I think over there, I've already mentioned this, we've tried to go down to the minimum diagnosable unit where we can and delve into the details where possible, and that's been fun. That's just one of the kingfisher plates. And yeah, then again for some of the finches. And again, you don't need, I mean, these are kinds of birds where you don't really need a lot of text to identify or to tell a red-faced crimson wing from a cordon bleu or violet-eared waxbill. It's pretty striking. So we did save that text for the tricky species and used them there. And the Jaegers is a good example of that. So I would still have actually liked a little more text, to be honest, because they're super tricky birds and they're not easy to tell apart, especially when they're not breeding and they're molting down here the way they often are. So anyway, that's that. And then we also tackled habitats systematically. So this became another COVID project. I worked on a book, which I've actually just seen the proofs of recently, called Habitats of Africa. I also studied botany at university. And being one of these people who's been lucky enough to flit around the continent, I've got a very good feel for, all the habitats of the continent and how you go about birding them. And what this is from a non-botanical perspective, trying to get not necessarily lay people, naturalists and people who are ecologists, but they're not botanists, to understand the key differences between some of the subtypes of these habitats. There's just a few plates from that book, but it does relate to the birds of Greater Southern Africa, and I'll tell you why in a tick. But I thought you'd like to see some of this. So we try to explain what are the main drivers of these habitats, the climate that each of them gets, and how that drives things. Is it drought, or is it elephants that modify habitat? Is it fires? What is it, and these cool little silhouettes and stuff like that. So hopefully people who are birding naturalists will be able to start really thinking about habitats in a way they hadn't before by having this information at hand. And that would be really cool for citizen science projects, because once we start matching bird distributions with habitats, and we're all talking the same language, and that's the idea of this project, is to get us all talking the same language in terms of what a habitat is. It's either fynbos or renosterbos or strandveld. Then we're in a very powerful position to be able to try and add value to some of that citizen science, some of those citizen science projects. So in the Birds of Greater Southern Africa, here's a few examples of some of the way we divvied up the habitats. And so this did come into play, not in the same detail, of course, that one would see in the Habitats of Africa book. But what we're trying to do is get a lot of buy-in from other field guide writers and authors to use the same habitat system. That way, whether we're in East Africa, we're talking about moist mixed savanna, or we're in Senegal and we're talking about moist mixed savanna, or we're in Southern Africa and we're talking about moist mixed savanna, it's all the same type. It's all the same thing. So that's the objectives there. And that's something unique about our project. Okay, and then seasonality was a fun one to deal with. So our region is complicated because it stretches from 8 degrees in the Zambian tropics all the way down to 60. So what is seasonality in an environment like that? Well, the tropics don't really have winters and summers per se. Yes, it is cooler in the months of June, July, May, June, July, August. But it's really driven by rainfall systems. So in the tropics, you have 3 seasons: a hot, dry one, a hot, wet one, and a cool, dry season. Then when we get to somewhere more temperate, like South Africa, for example, we really have the classic 4 seasons. And then when you get down to the poles, you really only have 2 seasons: a bitterly cold, dark winter and a light-filled summer. The shoulder seasons are relatively narrow and small. So seasonality is really, really fairly tricky to deal with when you're considering an entire region like this. And then also in terms of bird movement, I'm sure everybody at school will be familiar with the story of a barn swallow. I'm sure we will hear this as one of our first kind of ideas of movement of animals. These birds breed in the Palearctic, and then they come to Africa where they overwinter. I despise that term, and I'll soon be explaining why. But when we think about classic Southern Africa, the Kunene and the Zambezi forming the northern reaches of Southern Africa, there wasn't a lot of what we call passage migration. So a bird like a black-winged pratincoll, that'll come through Zambia, and it essentially moves through Zambia between October and November, and then it spends November through March south of that region, and then it moves back through in March and April. So it just passes through. That's a passage migrant, right? So all of a sudden, the tropics, we need to think about passage migration in a greater Southern Africa context. And then the subantarctic birds, well, in the southern summer of November, December, January, these birds are breeding on the islands, and then they tend to migrate during the austral winter of June, July, and August to the shelf waters of the continent where they forage extensively. So you're telling me that barn swallows are coming down to overwinter during the months of November, December, and January, while the subantarctic birds, which are actually going to winter in Southern Africa during the winter months, are not overwintering. It's a very confusing term. It needs to be absolutely eliminated. I eliminated it. And then we also, a lot of the time, don't really address certain other types of migration. We've got intra-African migration, which is obviously very key, birds like Wahlberg's eagle, and then nomadism, finchlarks, sparrowlarks, and lark-like buntings and things like that we know about. But then altitudinal migration, especially along the eastern mountains, birds moving up and down the mountains. Good example would be spotted ground thrush, but there's a lot of things that actually go up and down depending on the conditions, and it may not be something that they do a lot of. And then there's local movements. Birds like white-eyes will move in and out of people's gardens, and you might think you're seeing the same white-eyes, but they're actually white-eyes that move down to a different area and they get replaced by other white-eyes. So it's not just straightforward, you know. We needed to be a little bit more systematic with the way we treated these things. Sorry, that's just the migrants thing. And then there's a good example of the bee eaters, you know. So if you look at the top left map of the bee eaters, that's a European bee eater. 99% of the European bee eaters we see in greater Southern Africa are migrants from the Palearctic. But then there's also this population that's an intra-African migrant, and it breeds in the Western and Northern Cape, and then it goes into equatorial Africa where it doesn't breed. And then olive bee is another fun one, because there it's not straightforward at all. On the Mozambican coastline, we've got birds that are semi-resident. We then have a population in northwest Namibia that strictly comes in to breed temporarily, and you've got a whole bunch of other non-breeders that occur in the sort of interior reaches of Mozambique and Zambia. So it's not straight up and down. So the only way to really do this is kind of avoid using terms winter and summer, because we have parts of the region that never have a winter and a summer. And we just address where they breed, where they don't breed, whether they're resident or migrants, and which months they occur in those zones. And that is unambiguous and very, very clear as to what they're doing. So we try to create clarity when it came to that sort of stuff. And then the last fun thing was a vagrants watch list. It's a little bit gimmicky, I admit, but I also think it's a lot of fun. You know, birds that you really need to know what they look like before you encounter them in order to be able to identify them. There's a lot of these tricky petrels that, unless you actually know what you're looking for when you see it, you may misidentify it. And even if you've got cameras, and a lot of people are taking photos of these birds these days, you need to know what elements of the underwing pattern or what elements of the back you're really looking at when you're doing this stuff. So that was a fun thing. Were there any controversial decisions? I guess there always are. So these are just some of them. So we did breach the Kunene and the Zambezi for the first time. I think it's time. I really think people are ready for it. And I think it's a fun new element of birding in the region that hopefully people will enjoy. So there's been a lot of kind of criticism as, why didn't you put Angola in the book? Well, there's two reasons. Number one, it would have increased the numbers of species I had to treat by over 200, which takes it from being a fairly chunky field guide to an almost impossible to carry around field guide. So I didn't want to do that. But the other good news is that Angola is also getting its own book. Bloomsbury have commissioned a book for Angola, and so it will be coming out hopefully next year sometime. So that's good. So, you know, it's not like it's been ignored and forgotten about. I went for vernacular names that are less colloquial, less South African, and a lot more international. The reason is because we're dealing with 10 different countries. There's at least 7 regional languages we're dealing with. It's very, very hard to tell the Zambians and the Malawians that they should be calling their birds korhans rather than bustards. So I try to stick with a a global approach on the names. And there's a new working group on avian checklists that is trying to get everybody to agree on most of the names, which is a great thing. I think that, of course, there's a massively cool opportunity for people to develop colloquial names for birds, the isiZulu names, but I think this is a local NGO thing. I didn't think that was my remit within the book. So, and then again, yeah, the subspecies designations wasn't easy at times. I sometimes had to just go with the flow and put stuff in there that seemed logical without knowing whether it was the right decision or not. But I think, as I said earlier, there's so much to be learned and discovered about these things that if anybody finds something wrong, that's a major opportunity for us to improve the knowledge. So I think there's a real opportunity here to use this book to help us learn a whole lot more about our birds. Okay, and heading on to sort of the last sector of the talk. What about the future? Where we're going from here with these projects? So yes, there's an ebook. People are asking me about an app. There's so many good apps in the region already. I need to be sure I can do an app that's gonna be good enough. And so I'll consider it, but I'm not sure that there will be an app. We are talking about doing country field guides, so that book, which is a little bit hefty already, can be scaled down. So Zambia and Malawi is the first one in the works because it just fits the gap where even if you've got your other field guide, your Newman's or your Sassel or whatever, and you don't really want to buy this new hefty book, you probably might want to buy the Zambia Malawi one if you're ever going to go up there. And if there's demand for other regions, we'll do it, but we're going to stick with that first project first. And yeah, we want to make it better. So if there are any issues, please reach out and let me know. But maybe one of the fun potential developments that I'm talking about is developing a Greater Southern Africa birding region. And of course, the first question is why or what is it? Well, there it is. It does make sense to include Angola in that. Angola is a country that is connected by roads quite well to Namibia and Zambia. It doesn't really fit in with anywhere else. And so it would be the region covered in our book, plus the addition of Angola. And I think that would make a heck of a fun area to explore. And I'm going to sort of discuss that a little bit more now. So why do it? Well, look, this is not so it's not like a competitor for Southern Africa. It never will be. People are obsessed with Southern Africa. They always will be. Probably 90% of birders will always only do the Southern Africa stuff. But it's an addition. It's something else that you can do. I don't know if any of you guys are really aware of things like the Western Palearctic or the AOU, which is an American region that includes Panama and stuff. But it's a slightly wider area that's more inclusive, that appeals to a subset of birders that are maybe more adventurous, or maybe they've just seen a lot of stuff in the region. So I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people on 850 plus, if they're listers, that are sitting at home drinking tea, waiting for the rare bird alerts to come through because that's the only thing that they've got left to see. Whereas now, if we sort of create another region that's got a whole bunch of cool new resident birds, and not just resident birds, but also things that areas that really, really need to be visited. I'll go into that in a sec, but I think that it could be a lot of fun. And then, of course, there's always been this weird disconnect in with the sea trips where people leave Cape Town and Durban, and then there's a 200 nautical mile limit, and then they're out of their Southern Africa region, and then what do they do with that? So when we've got these BirdLife South Africa type fundraisers, these cruises to Marion, Flock to Marion, and things like that, it's not very satisfactory. There's no real cohesive region there that people can put these birds that they see outside the 200 nautical mile limit on. A lot of folks are not that interested in a world list or maybe a Africa continental list or something like that. But having a Greater Southern African regional list where you can now have a bunch of these cruises to nowhere would be a lot of fun. So yeah, you would be on a Marion cruise, and anywhere in the region that's oceanic around the continent would be part of that region. So I think that's kind of fun. And then perhaps most importantly, from a conservation perspective, we need to improve the ornithological knowledge of some of these areas. Angola is just absolutely mind-blowingly incredible. Zambia has got these areas of forest along the DRC border that are just unknown and continue to produce new species. This is a vermiculated fishing owl, by the way. And that was discovered by Errol de Beer in 2011 on the borders of the DRC. And, you know, when there's such cool birds out there, if you had a whole set of Southern African birders are excellent birders, you know, and if they were out there actually exploring these lesser known areas, who knows what we could find. I still think there's a possibility, especially in northern Mozambique on these mountains, of species brand new to science being discovered there. So I really think that the benefits to African ornithology by having Southern Africans or some subset of Southern Africans enjoying the greater Southern African region and visiting places like Zambia, Malawi, northern Mozambique, and Angola more would only be beneficial from a conservation perspective. And who knows, you know, you could eventually kick off things like local guide schemes, and maybe there'd be more conservation projects. Like places like Zalanyama in Malawi are slightly depressing. It's one of the best Miombo birding sites on the planet. And yet, you know, they're chopping that forest down relentlessly because there's just not enough visitors going there who pay for it to be conserved. So, and then there's also quite a lot of conservation money in transnational funding opportunities. CASA, which is the Kavango Zambezi Basin project, is one currently that's running. And whether it's World Bank money or stuff like that, I think if you have a more, well, not necessarily a cohesive region, but a more expanded region with more international collaboration, you're that much more likely to be able to attract funding. So I think these things would all be kind of cool from a greater Southern Africa birding region perspective. So I have, yeah, and then in terms of conservation benefits, I think I've basically covered that, right? So I do think that the book per se, if it makes birders better, we're paying more attention to races, sexes, and stuff, that those are better citizen scientists. We end up improving our base knowledge and just, I mean, you can already see it with the younger birders coming through Southern Africa today. They just, fact is, they're just much better than me and my generation were. And then also places, you know, often once you have a book, then people will start offering bespoke safari products like birding safari things to a country like Malawi and Zambia. So I'm really hoping that those will increase with international visitors, and hopefully that'll result in more local guides there, and that just builds the community and makes things better. And ultimately, if we have a region that's expansive and includes much of the ocean, then you could actually just do fundraising cruises like flocks to nowhere. You know, you could just take a ship into the middle of the Indian Ocean and float around there and look for whatever floats your boat out there, literally. So I don't know. I think there's lots to be gained by creating a larger region. Again, it's not meant to compete or to interfere or to be problematic to Southern Africa. It's just an alternative, wider region that may be of interest to a handful or a small proportion of the current community. And yeah, I'm pretty close to being done, folks. So thanks very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say. And yeah, if you want to check out anything else, that's where I'm at in terms of I've got a website for the book, and I'm busy developing it. So to put a lot of this this greater Southern Africa birding area stuff on there. So a lot of the kind of maps and the content that you've seen today, and I'm working on having a master checklist for Greater Southern Africa, including Angola at the moment, so that people can download that and stuff like that. So it's a work in progress. So hang tight, and yeah, I'm at keith@tropicalbirding.com if you want to hit me up with something. And of course, go out and buy the book. The two best places right now are luit.co.za. We're selling it for a crazy low price at $2.99, I think. Or you can buy from someone like BirdLife South Africa and support the conservation efforts. And yeah, I think that's it. So thanks, Derek. I don't know how you tapped me in. I just need to stop sharing, I guess.
Thanks so much, Keith. And I forgot that I had this book sitting on my desk here, which I did get from Loot at
Excellent.
the cheaper price.
Yes, yeah, yeah. No, no, I'm really
And
excited.
it's a really exciting book. I mean, I keep picking it up, when I have a minute. Sometimes I work at my desk, so sometimes between meetings or something, I peep into it. So it sits here under my other monitor, and yeah, it's amazing to hear the story behind it,
Mm,
and to understand what you were doing and why you were doing it. It gives it a whole different perspective.
right,
It's not just words and pictures on pages.
right,
There's more to the story than that. So thanks
yeah,
very much for that.
yeah, cool.
We have some questions in the chat. I'll just pick them up and
Right.
and read them out. So let's see. A couple of people asked why not Angola. I think you've answered that now.
Mhm.
Um, is there an app planned? I think you answered that as well, including the information of the book plus photos and audio. And if so, when do you think it will be available?
So not at the moment, yeah.
Yeah.
And
And then,
maybe we'll do it, but basically I've got to basically squeeze the publishers to make sure that we can put together a world-class app because I don't want to do something unless it's going to stand a chance of being the best. I do think the book has a very real possibility of being regarded as the best in the region. And if I can't do an app that would be of a similar quality, I don't want to do.
that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Somebody's asking, let me just get the name. Ariane is asking which taxonomic order the book is following.
It's a traditional taxonomic order, so we pretty much. I mean, obviously, with all field guides, I think we run into this problem where we have birds that. I mean, some of it's a convenience thing with the way the plates work, but it is pretty much starts at ostriches and game birds and finishes with the finches. So I'm not doing the new modified major phylogenetic dust up where. So we're creatures of habit. Most of us are used to that old taxonomy. And that's how we tend to find the birds. I'm always going towards the front to look for game birds. I don't want to find them on, the three last pages of the book. And so I've stuck with that because I want it to be something that is user friendly. Um, yeah, so that's, and you got to make a decision one way or another.
This is from David Fiedler. He's asking where are the shoe bills located in your photo?
In the photo, in the book.
You had a photo of shoe bill, I think, and he's asking where was it taken. I think that's what he's asking.
That was from Uganda. So that's a Uganda. It's actually a picture by our colleague Ken Barron's, not even mine, but a gorgeous shot. So yeah, that was a Uganda picture, but the shoe bills are in Bangwelu Swamp in Zambia. So it's a fair dinkum bird, and they're resident, and you can go see them. So there's really cool birds just to the north of the Kunene and the Zambezi and I think this is another one of the funny things that people, unless it's in your face in a book, like you're saying, like you're fleeing through the thing, and then all of a sudden you stop and you go, oh my goodness, is this thing really just north of me here, And that suddenly gives it context because all of a sudden we're seeing these animals in a book that treats birds we're familiar with, our crested barbets or our Birchall's cuckoos and things like that. And all of a sudden we're seeing these birds are really close to us and they're only just over this border. And that means that people are more likely to do it. I think it's out of sight, out of mind. So the fact that the old books never did it, even though these things were on our doorstep, nobody was really willing to make the move because why?
Okay, there's another question from Ariane. So let me just read it. Is there any difference in size, print, or paper quality and/or content between this book published as a Princeton field guide or as a Helm field guide?
No, it's identical. So, but Princeton are only putting it out in August. So that's Helm's already out. The South African edition is out, but the Princeton one will only hit the shelves in August. Oh, I see. Is it ISC or HBW? So basically, we tend to follow Clement's taxonomy. But there was I mean, I'm actually no, not that this means anything in terms of what you should be doing in a field guide, but I'm a taxonomist by training. So the work I did on the larks was a phylogenetic study. And so sometimes I would look at papers. So particularly the game birds was a tricky one because there was these new game bird studies that were done, but they were somewhat controversial because People didn't like the sample sizes for some of the studies and da 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 da. And so I kind of went through that paper and I decided for myself what I thought was good enough and what I didn't. So just based on my understanding of what I thought was robust in terms of the data. And so I did pick and choose some of the stuff, but it is mostly based on climates. Yeah.
Well, that's the last question, and I think Keith will let you go off and get your dinner, and so thanks very much for doing this for us, and it's great
Cool.
to see you and hear the story, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime on Learn the Birds, and everybody, thanks for attending this evening's session, and yeah, don't forget to pick up the book that Keith was talking about, and I think it's definitely one that's worth having.
Thanks for hosting me, Derek. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your audience about it. And like I say, yeah, please reach out to me and chat to me if you have ideas, or because I mean I think it's kind of cool to have, like, because we have it these days we have these forums where we can actually engage with a wider audience, and it's fun. It'll be fun to chat to users and see what they want out of future editions, or what they like, what they don't like. We can always tweak. It's fun. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Keith, and thanks everybody. Good
Cheers,
night.
guys.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thanks.